just wanted to start off by saying thank you so much for being here and welcome to the Anxious Attachment Style Reprogramming course. I'm super excited to be able to share this content with you today. And if you haven't already had the chance, please make sure that you print off your workbook or pull it up on your computer so that either way you can follow along with all the different exercises we'll be going through, the different reprogramming processes, and to make sure that you can really get clear on what some of your core wounds and patterns are so that you can get the most out of this course possible. Also, if you haven't already had the chance to, please connect through our Facebook Personal Development School page where we can share our conversations and breakthroughs with other like-minded individuals. And you can also feel free to post some of your questions and breakthroughs on the Personal Development University platform, where all members can connect with each other, can share. And again, I'll be pulling a lot of the questions I enter into webinars from that space. So please also check out the monthly webinars that we'll be offering so I can stay connected to you, we can interact live, and I can make sure that all of your questions are answered. So in today's itinerary, we will be covering some of the root causes for how anxious attachment style comes about in the first place. We will also be discussing core wounds and triggers that the anxious attachment individual experiences. We'll talk about different needs related to healing and how to get these needs met yourself, as well as how to effectively express them so you can get them met through relationship. And then we'll also be covering a little bit about interactions with other attachment styles and some really important tools for conflict communication and self-awareness. In this module, we are going to be covering a little bit about who is the anxious attachment style individual, how to recognize them, and some of the root causes of anxious attachment, how these things came about, and then we'll dive into core patterns and reprogramming in the future modules. So first and foremost, often anxious attachment style individuals tend to be really good connectors. They tend to be quite social, they tend to be extroverted, they tend to not really love being alone, and they tend to avoid being alone, not at all costs, but fairly strongly. Keep in mind, not all extroverts are necessarily anxiously attached individuals, but there does tend to be a correlation. Also, anxiously attached individuals tend to be people who you'll find share quite quickly and quite easily. They tend to be really good with connecting deeply, and they have a hard time being alone romantically as well. They tend to almost be in back-to-back relationships fairly often. If they're out of relationships, they will be actively seeking relationships a lot of the time as well. So sometimes the anxiously attached individual can appear needy or almost clingy in a relationship. They tend to not do well with space between themselves and their romantic partner. And sometimes when there's distance being created, you'll find that these individuals keep trying to attach closer and closer and further and further. So they might do things like call repetitively or keep reaching out or text continuously. And usually their expectations for connection are really high. They're hoping to be in contact with their romantic partner, maybe over text message almost all day long or all repeatedly throughout the day. Now, for some individuals, when we enter into the honeymoon phase, we'll have a lot of connection and closeness, and we will talk a lot and often. But for anxiously attached individuals, this tends to last beyond the honeymoon phase, and they tend to sort of maintain those expectations, which often results in feeling rejected for the anxious attached individual by their partner when the honeymoon phase ends. They tend to not be able to understand that, past that 2-year mark or so, once individuals settle in, sometimes the need for that consistent connection and consistent closeness drops for other attachment styles, and it can be really painful and difficult for the anxiously attached individual to process and to understand and to make peace with. So they usually have really high expectations for how often and how much their partners are going to be in communication and connection with them. Anxiously attached individuals are also hyper vigilant about being abandoned. And we're going to go into where this comes from in childhood. But they tend to give a lot of meaning to space. They'll feel like, oh my goodness, this person doesn't love me anymore. They're leaving. We're growing apart. We're disconnected. I'm not good enough. And there tends to be a lot of really painful triggers that create a strong anxiety response in the anxiously attached individual when space is taking place between themselves and their partner. And anxiety often can take over the mind and the imagination wherever there is an incongruency or stress in the relationship. So anxiously attached individuals create a lot of what we call activating strategies, all these sort of subconscious excuses or justifications to get closer to their partner. And these can be any forms of trying to just get some kind of reinforcement or validation from their partner. Even things like trying to test their partner or make their partner jealous, and basically try to elicit an emotional response that proves that their partner cares. And again, this just comes from a really vulnerable space in this individual. So usually for the anxiously attached child, between the ages of 0 to 2 years old, there tends to be an extreme incongruency. And this can be really challenging because this incongruency is not consistent enough where the anxiously attached child can really break off from their parent and learn how to self-soothe and meet their own needs, like some of the more avoidant attachment styles. Instead, the parents tend to show up almost just enough that the child feels dependent and feels like it can only get its needs met for safety, for security, for soothing through the parents. And yet the parents tend to be really inconsistent, although they are very safe when they do show up. So for example, you might see that the incongruency can take place in parents being very emotionally available and quite stable, but the parents might work a lot. So they're there for the child and they show up well, and the child attaches and feels like that's safe and that's good. But then there's almost this separation anxiety triggered because the child doesn't learn to self-soothe and break off from the parents. And then the parents go to work and the child feels abandoned. And it's really interesting because when we look at how trauma impacts the subconscious mind, what we find is that one specific traumatic imprint, so something like a car accident, can create a really strong impact on the subconscious mind. But any repetitive emotional incidents where there's the repetitive component and strong emotions attached, this actually creates, more often than not, a stronger imprint on the subconscious mind than any one specific individual trauma. Now keep in mind, this is sort of on a spectrum. This is not black and white. It depends on how intense the emotional imprint is and how frequent it is. But when we look at how this applies to the anxiously attached individual, if there's a young child who almost on a daily basis has one of their only biological fears, being the fear of abandonment, triggered, well, what happens is this individual has strong emotional imprints being impacted on their subconscious mind on a very repetitive basis. So usually what we'll see is that the trauma that takes place for the anxiously attached individual in childhood tends to have really strong, deep roots. And so we can look at other examples for a moment as well of how the anxiously attached imprint comes about. So for example, it can be that the parents are very available and then working a lot. It can also be that one parent is very, giving and very available, and the other parent is quite avoidant and is emotionally withdrawn. And so maybe when the child is with one parent or caregiver, they feel safe and secure, but when they're with the other caregiver, they start to feel unsafe, and they're seeking and hungering for that initial caregiver where they feel like there's a secure attachment bond. And so anywhere that there's strong incongruencies, another example might be that, parents are very available, very secure, and then something sort of happens where for a period of time, the parents have to go away, and they have to take actual physical space. And so anything that can trigger this strong impact for the child, that secure bond that they need and come to rely and depend upon, is being inconsistently or intermittently reinforced and often taken away, this can be something that creates this major imprinted fear of abandonment for the anxious attachment individual. And so this, of course, gets brought right back into our adult romantic relationships. So any incongruency, any extremes demonstrated by the parents between hot and cold, or any flipping experience between intense love and then that intense love being withdrawn, not because the caregiver becomes unpredictable in their behaviors, but because the caregiver literally can't be physically present or fully emotionally available at times. So what happens is when this anxiously attached child has these experiences repeatedly imprinted over time, and then they enter into an adult romantic relationship, they experience extreme anxiety regarding relationships, and they tend to maintain that lack of ability to self-soothe, because just like in childhood, they didn't have enough disconnect to feel like they learned to rely on themselves to meet their own needs, or to soothe separately from the caregiver, they tend to bring that into their adult romantic relationship. So as soon as they feel connected, there's this unconscious expectation for their romantic partner to literally soothe them, take care of them, make sure that they feel emotionally stable and secure. And this can be a major limitation in the anxiously attached individual's subconscious mind, because it's really challenging to be in a healthy relationship dynamic, or even to feel safe and secure in a relationship dynamic when you are dependent on somebody showing up very consistently and very repeatedly over time. So anytime there's distance in a relationship between the anxiously attached individual and their romantic partner, it's extremely triggering for this individual. They're basically reigniting these deep wounds, these traumas essentially around abandonment. They'll experience emotions like extreme anxiety, fear, sadness, disconnect. Often secondary layers for the anxiously attached individual are things like feeling not good enough, perceiving rejection, feeling like they have to compensate or control the situation to try to get their partner back or to keep them close. And so there tends to be not just this anxiety and fear component, but a lot of misperceived experiences. And anxiously attached individuals also are known for putting their partner on a pedestal, having very high regard for their partner, but low self-esteem a lot of the time. And that's not just coming from some of that patterning and some of those core wounds that we'll get into later, of feeling like they're not good enough or feeling like they can't be on their own, and it's frightening and scary. But this also comes from, whenever we subordinate consistently to individuals in our behaviors, it actually creates a detriment to our self-esteem. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. So the anxiously attached individual, once they've built that bond with somebody, once they've connected, they can seemingly only be soothed by their partner in a relationship. And they tend to require significant reinforcement that, of course, can come across to the other partner as insecurity or neediness or clinginess. And it can be really challenging for both individuals, because one person might feel like, okay, this person's insecure and it's triggering me and I have to sort of back away. And the anxiously attached individual, when that backing away happens, tends to sort of hunger for more. So whereas you might see with other attachment styles that the fearful avoidant might shut down when their partner pulls away, or the dismissive avoidant might just continuously withdraw into themselves, what we tend to see for the anxiously attached individual is that they keep coming and keep trying to reconnect and keep trying to open the conversation again. And it can literally be, through all these different interesting justifications that the anxiously attached individual may not even recognize that they're doing. So sometimes I'll hear anxiously attached clients say things to me like, he said he wanted space, but I know that he's just saying that because he's trying to test me to see if I'll come and show up or not. And so, I went and stopped by his house and surprised him. And, sometimes we'll see that the anxiously attached individual isn't necessarily listening to their partner's needs, because they tend to often be projecting from where they're coming from. And if they might be, testing their partner or creating space to really see if their partner will come through, they tend to assume that their partner's doing the same. And again, it creates this barrier or miscommunication. Or sometimes I'll hear an anxiously attached person say, she's shutting down and she's pulling away, but I know she's just expecting more from me and she wants more closeness. So, I'm just going to keep trying and keep calling and keep getting in touch. And again, that cycle and pattern tends to sort of repeat itself, because the anxiously attached individual who is struggling sort of to self-soothe, their subconscious mind will create a lot of these activating strategies. So these, again, justifications to try to get around listening to their partner's needs as a means to actually quell their anxiety, because it's actually what they want, right? If I can reach out and finally get in touch with this person, then I might feel a little more safe and secure again. So first and foremost, we just want to take note, if you are the anxiously attached individual, none of this is your fault. This is literally the result of such deeply wired roots of abandonment and feeling abandoned and fearing abandonment. And, these things are quite traumatic, and they've created a very deep imprint into your psyche. And we also want to take note of, hey, these things are reprogrammable. We are accountable for these things, and we also want to become really aware of our activating strategies, because sometimes our subconscious mind will sort of play tricks on us and justify things that may prevent us from actually seeing and hearing and understanding our partner's needs. Again, just as a subconscious strategy to try to not have to feel those feelings of abandonment. So often, as a partner pulls away from the anxiously attached individual, and not necessarily because they're pulling away out of disinterest in the relationship, but maybe because they had a hard day or a hard week, or because there's been a little bit of conflict recently and that person's just sort of taking a step back to protect themselves, or there's a blip in the relationship, or they're going through a challenging time. As this happens, for whatever reason it is, oftentimes the anxiously attached individual becomes more triggered, and they feel that distance, and they're sort of hyper vigilant about distance in a relationship. So they become very attuned to anything that can be related to distance, pulling back, being disconnected, and they'll try to sort of manage and control all of these things as a way of trying to manage all of the trauma that those feelings could sort of bubble up inside. They're trying to prevent and keep pushed down by controlling the connection and how deeply and how consistently the anxiously attached individual is connected with their partner on a regular basis. So sometimes we'll even hear the anxiously attached individual referred to as the love addict, because they can be almost obsessively or addictively in need of romantic connection, in need of emotional connection in a relationship. And there's usually a very strong lack of the anxiously attached individual being able to maintain a relationship to themselves while they are in a romantic relationship. And oftentimes as well, they experience a bit of a difficult time being alone or without a relationship. So sometimes we'll even see anxiously attached individuals go from one relationship to another to another. More often than not, these relationships are not even ideal for what the anxiously attached individual would want. They may not be with somebody who truly is what they want, or who's truly who they would want to be with, but more so, they're continuously connecting and jumping from relationship to relationship just to avoid having to feel all of that trauma of feeling disconnected, alone in the world, abandoned, some of those really painful things that were programmed in and felt a lot in early childhood. Anxiously attached individuals as well tend to derive a very strong sense of self-worth and purpose from their relationships. So they spend a lot of time thinking, okay, I'm good enough because I'm with this person who's this smart or this attractive or this financially abundant or has this good of a career. And so they tend to derive a lot of their sense of self through how good enough their partner is. And again, this isn't always the case, but it's something that I often see in terms of the anxious attachment patterning. And we're going to get into, internal and external core beliefs in a bit. But anxiously attached individuals as well tend to associate relationships with sort of these highs and lows, because think about it. Let's say that to a certain degree, the anxiously attached individual is a little bit of a love addict, and maybe they're addicted to the dopamine rush and the oxytocin, the bonding neurochemical, and the serotonin, the feeling of well-being from feeling connected and safe in the world through relationship. And maybe they're addicted to some of their needs being met through relationships. So feeling significant, they tend to derive a lot of their sense of significance through romantic relationships. Love and connection, certainty, all these things tend to come from their perception that they're in a good and stable relationship. But what often happens is, just like any other addict who might, become dependent on a substance or alcohol or, whatever else it might be, just like anybody else, there's highs and lows. So there's these addictive qualities where we can latch on and become, very dependent on this thing. And then the moment we don't have this thing, it becomes extremely excruciating for that individual. And I would use that as an analogy, for the anxiously attached person, because they can feel like it's really excruciating when there's any juxtaposition of high levels of connection next to low levels of connection or somebody withdrawing. It really triggers deep-rooted fears in the anxious attachment individual's subconscious mind. Often as well, anxiously attached individuals can experience some shame and embarrassment for being this way, feeling, helpless and judging themselves for calling so much or showing up unannounced or trying so hard to make their partner jealous or feeling so jealous and possessive of their partner. And this is, again, quite analogous to like somebody actually experiencing an addiction. If we imagine that somebody's addicted to a substance, right? Let's say cocaine. There are these highs and then there are these lows when we go through that withdrawal period. And then, followed up by that tends to be shame. Oh my gosh, why did I do that? What's wrong with me? Embarrassment, feelings of helplessness to this experience and self-judgment. And so truly, to a certain degree, anxiously attached individuals, though not all, and though it is a spectrum, do tend to have some kind of dependency on emotional bond, on emotional connection. We really want to become aware of this and adopt an attitude of non-judgment. We want to be able to inquire into the roots of this. And just like I say with anything else, with guilt, with shame, where we are judging or guilting or shaming ourselves, we get so lost in the story of what's right and wrong and good and bad that we prevent ourselves from being able to see underneath that and really look into the roots of the problem so we can solve it at that level. So I would urge you, as you go through the modules of this course, to make sure that you are adopting an attitude of non-judgment towards yourself and gentleness towards yourself, in recognizing that you got these programs and patterns from traumatic events that you experienced in early childhood, and that these things need to be rewired and repatterned, which will then create a change in your behavioral responses, as we'll get into in the next modules. Lastly, anxiously attachment individuals can tend to be quite charming and sweet and charismatic individuals. They're often expressive and thoughtful and excellent sharers, and they tend to show up very, very well in romantic relationships, always thinking of other people's needs, going above and beyond to look out for their partner, to do kind, sweet things for their partner. And they tend to feel a little bit incomplete when they're not in relationships. So love is essentially, for the anxiously attached individual, the number one vice for them. It can be intoxicating. Sometimes anxiously attached individuals will experience limerence, those really high, intense emotional connections to people at very early stages of relationships that, again, can seriously feel like they are a drug. And sometimes we'll see overly intense behaviors from an anxiously attached individual in terms of romantic partnership, trying very, very hard too early, trying to make a commitment happen right out of the gates. And sometimes anxiously attached individuals can even become so preoccupied with the romantic area of their lives that they fall behind in other areas. Because in reality, we all have 7 areas of life. And if we are not giving quite balanced attention to all these different areas, then we over time, by hyper-focusing on 1 or 2 major areas, it takes our ability to grow away from the other areas, and usually we have to learn out of hardship instead. So for example, as an analogy, let's say you take a male who's in his 40s and he's super career driven and has been super focused on career and finances for the better part of 2 decades. If this man is totally not paying attention to his physical health or his family relationships, what we might see is that, the partner leaves, or there's a divorce because, the partner's not feeling like they're getting their needs met. And then that man has to go take time away from his career, and it might even hurt his finances because he has to go take time from these 2 areas he's been overly focused and imbalancedly obsessing over, and to go deal with, some of the destruction that's happened in the other areas from not paying attention. Or similarly, if he's not taking care of his physical health, maybe he has to take his time off from career or making money because he's run into a health concern. So it's really important, and we're going to use this analogy and apply it to the anxiously attached individual. It's really important that if this is you, that you're looking to balance out the other 7 areas of your life and not just being hyper-focused on romantic relationships. And what this will actually do will help you to maintain your identity outside of romantic relationships, which then sets you up for better long-term health and longevity in your relationships, so that there won't be this disconnect, there won't be this separation over time. So we're going to get into some of these things a little bit later on. So another few things that are important to note about the anxiously attached individual is that they can also be hopeless romantics. They tend to have these deep programmed ideals, sort of out of like storybooks or movies for what romance should look like and feel like. And they tend to be a little bit less practical or realistic in these areas, which can be really challenging because, our romantic relationships are just not always like, romantic movies or storybooks or, some of the Disney movies we're exposed to in childhood. And so it can create some really painful expectations in the anxiously attached individual's mind that can set them up for feelings of rejection. So we're going to talk about this later on. And this doesn't mean that we shouldn't have these really beautiful moments in relationships. It's just that our relationships will not always be in a peak state. I'm going to take a break here and let you soak up everything so far. In the next part of this module, we will go through and discuss some other key need-to-knows about the anxious, preoccupied attachment style individual. I'm going to pick back up in this module with some of the patterns of our beloved anxious attachment style individuals and dive right into root causes. These hopeless romantics or anxiously attached individuals also tend to get a lot of their needs met through fantasizing about romance and love. So our brain doesn't just get its emotional needs met through the present and through our actual experiences, but it also gets its needs met through the stored emotional associations from old memories in the past or from fantasies about future events that could occur. Because when we imagine and visualize and feel about those events, they elicit an emotional response. And again, we can even become a little bit addicted to the neurochemistry of a projected future, which I often see as a bit of a pattern for anxiously attached individuals. Anxiously attached individuals as well sometimes come from a codependent household. Though I see this less to be the case than individuals in fearful avoidant dynamics, it is something that can often happen. So anxiously attached individuals do tend to carry a belief pattern that says, I am responsible for how other people feel, and other people are responsible for how I feel. And, can go to great lengths to try to control how somebody else might feel as a romantic gesture, but then also unconsciously expect their romantic partner to do the same. So they can fall into some of these codependent habits or patterns or traits. Anxiously attached individuals as well tend to have a really big fear of losing a partner. And this may not just be to, somebody else or because a relationship ends, but sometimes we'll see that the anxiously attached individual has a lot of fears of, what if something bad happens to my partner? What if they're unsafe? What if they got in an accident? And sometimes the thought patterns of an anxiously attached individual can be really related to safety and negative events or something bad happening. And these can be things that really work up the anxiously attached individual. Now, the anxiously attached individual as well tends to have a major fear of rejection. And I want you to note why, if this is you. So if you look at other attachment styles as a general rule, they are not as often deriving so many of their 6 basic human needs from romantic relationships specifically. So when we look at the 6 basic human needs, some of these needs that we are naturally wired for, and you'll hear Tony Robbins discuss this, we have growth, we have certainty, we have uncertainty, we have significance, we have contribution, and we have love and connection. And so when we look at anxiously attached individuals in relationships, they tend to get obviously their love and connection met from romantic relationships. They tend to derive their sense of significance from romantic relationships because they feel like there's meaning in their lives when they're seen and heard and understood and romantically connected. So they derive a lot of their meaning in their lives from romantic relationships as a general rule. They also tend to get a lot of their needs met for certainty through romantic relationships. Trying to, have a romantic relationship makes them feel safe in their life because, again, there are associations from childhood where, when my parents are not home, I start feeling really unsafe, and when they finally come back, I feel soothed again. So that those natural associations and programming exist there. And then also uncertainty. So novelty, variety, new experiences, they tend to get a lot of that through the romantic relationship and wanting to always do new things and try new activities with their partner specifically. And then if we look at, our other basic human needs of growth, anxiously attached individuals tend to look at their growth need through the filter of relationships. They feel like they're growing in their lives when their relationship is growing, when love is growing, when their connection is growing. And other attachment styles will feel this way too, but tend to be much more focused on things like, personal growth for the fearful avoidant. Are they intellectually and emotionally growing? Or, career growth for some of these more avoidant attachment styles. And a lot of them get their needs met through things outside of relationships, partially because they had some negative associations more so to their caregivers in childhood. But, this can be really challenging when an anxiously attached individual feels rejected. It's not just, for the anxious attachment, it's not just, rejection of connection. It's rejection of part of their identity every time. It's rejection of all of these 6 basic human needs are getting met through romantic partnership. And so it stings much more, it hurts much deeper because it's touching on core wounds, major traumas they've experienced in childhood through that consistent, repetitive, emotional feeling of abandonment, but also because anxiously attached individuals derive so much of their sense of self through those 6 basic human needs from relationships specifically, it tends to feel like they're almost having an identity crisis when a relationship is falling apart. Like they feel like they're losing themselves because they're deriving themselves through relationship itself. So we also project from our perception, and this is so important for the anxiously attached individual to note. For the anxious attachment, we'll see that they tend to assume that everybody wants connection as much as them. And we all do this. We all assume that everybody has the same needs and the same belief patterns and the same emotional responses, and we tend to project those things onto other individuals. So it's really difficult for the anxiously attached individual to feel that their partner wants space or just needs space or needs time apart or wants to do activities separately or just wants to do something on their own or needs some time alone to recharge. For the anxiously attached individual who doesn't feel that they need that, even though they do, and we'll get into this later, really they're too busy avoiding even feeling that because the fear of the abandonment trauma coming up is so great and our brain is so wired to avoid pain more so even than seek pleasure. So the anxiously attached individual perceives that they don't need time alone, and so when they want connection so much and they hunger for it, and then another individual needs space a little bit or time, it's really difficult for them to understand that without personalizing it. And so they tend to think, oh, there's something going on in the relationship. This person's rejecting me. We're falling apart. What did I do? Did I do something wrong? Did I offend them in some way? And a lot of anxiously attached individuals think thoughts like this and also burden themselves with a lot of responsibility for being so perfect in the relationship and never doing anything wrong out of that fear of loss. So the experience as an anxiously attached person is that there's this strong need for approval, strong need for validation, strong need for ongoing consistent connection to quite strong degrees the vast majority of the time. And sometimes the anxiously attached individual can have this sort of weaker sense of self outside of the relationship dynamic. And they often experience really poor boundaries because they are so busy trying to avoid feeling those core childhood wounds of those fears of abandonment that they try to do this through people pleasing or, enmeshing with other people. And so those poor boundaries where this individual doesn't know where, they end and another person begins, and that hungering for almost that codependent relationship or that enmeshment actually creates a long-term detriment to relationships more so than it helps them to not be abandoned. So sometimes as well, the anxiously attached individual will struggle with feelings of unworthiness or just this consistent overcompensation in romantic relationships, because if they're putting their partner on a pedestal and perceiving themselves as lesser than, then of course there's this ongoing need to overgive, overdo, overcompensate for this subconsciously perceived deficit in who you are relative to who your romantic partner is. And again, so much of this is actually just the subconscious mind creating these strategies to stay connected as a means to avoid that biological abandonment wound that can be activated. So keep in mind as well that anxiously attached individuals can experience different attachment styles around different people. So if they're with somebody secure, this programming will not be as strong. They'll tend to get a little more validation and consistency from a secure partner, and so that can contribute to the overall health of a relationship. And anxiously attached individuals as well can show up a little bit different in friendships and in romantic relationships. But in the next set of modules, we're going to go through some of the core wounds and how to deeply reprogram these wounds through reprogramming activities and through reprogramming behaviors and rituals, so that you don't have to struggle with this deep feeling of fear as soon as you enter into a relationship and notice any kind of shift in a pattern of behavior that really might not have anything to do with you. So stay tuned in the next modules for how to get some really good tools on how to reprogram and how to identify some of your needs and how to learn to be healthy in and out of a romantic relationship. Welcome to Module 2, Part 1. In this module, we are going to be going through the internal core wounds and beliefs of the anxiously attached individual. We're going to go through some tools for reprogramming. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we can accidentally create our own suffering and how to change this. So, some of the internal core wounds. I like to separate wounds and negative belief patterns into two parts. Internal, so the things that we believe about ourselves, and external, the things that we tend to project onto our external environment.